A very good afternoon to one and all, and I welcome to the another interesting series of lectures. And we have with us today Professor Tom McLeish, the Fellow of the Royal Society, Department of Physics and Humanities Research Institute, University of York, UK. And he'll be talking to us on the topic Narratives of Hope, Science, Theology, and Public Science. And this particular special public lecture is part of the joint initiative of the National Academy of Sciences India Delhi chapter and the Upadhyaya College, University of Delhi, under the aegis of the DPT Star College program, where we invite experts from different areas of science, engineering, and technology to apprise us about the history, prospects, and the emerging trends, and highlighting the interdisciplinarity of the various topics which are covered in the broad areas of science and engineering also, and trying to relate it with the day-to-day life in this case. So before inviting Professor Tom to deliver his talk, let me briefly introduce him to all the attendees. He's a professor of natural philosophy in the Department of Physics at the University of York, England, and is also affiliated to the university's Center for Medieval Studies and Humanities Research Center. His scientific research in soft matter and biological physics drawn on collaboration with chemists, engineers, and biologists to study relationships between molecular structure and emergent material properties, and was recognized by major awards in the US and Europe. He currently leads the UK Physics of Life Network and holds a 5-year personal research fellowship focusing on the physics of protein signaling and the self-assembly of silk fibers. He wrote a short introduction to the field soft matter, a very short introduction, in the year 2020. And in terms of the other academic interests, it includes framing of science, theology, society, and history, and the theory of creativity in art and science, leading to the recent book which he has contributed in this area. 2 recent books, Faith and Wisdom in Science and Let There Be a Science, articulate a theological narrative for the science and support his work co-leading with Professor David Wilkinson of Durham. The major project equipping Christian leadership in an age of science. This work was recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury Langford Award in the year 2018, and he has been a reader in the Angelic Church since 1995 in the Diocese of Ripon and York. From 2008 to 2014, he served as a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at the Durham University from 2015 to 2020 as a chair of the Royal Society's Education Committee. He is currently on the Royal Society's Council and is trustee of the John Templeton Foundation. With these words, I now invite Professor Tom to kindly share his screen to deliver his talk.
Thank you, Professor Saxena, very much indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Saxena. Yep, I will do that.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, there we go, and that should bring up the first slide. Good. Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, perhaps unusual ones, framing thoughts around science. Now, Professor Saxena and I were having a few bandwidth issues, so if that's true, then what I can do is, I don't know whose end it is. If it's my end, I'll turn my video off so you can just see the slides and hear my voice. But do let me know. And Dr. Ashok Kumar-Dixit, it's lovely to see you again. I remember you from our time together at Leeds University, so it's great to have a personal contact here as well. In fact, since those days at Leeds with Ashok, I've been at the universities of Durham and now York, so I thought I'd show you these magnificent buildings of the cathedrals from Durham on the right, that's York Minster on the left. And just to mention, if anyone wants to take any of these ideas further around ancient sources for positive narratives around science, I have a book with OUP, which is that book down there, Faith and Wisdom in Science. And with no further ado, let us move Straight on. And of course, by all means, do ask questions during the chat. Absolutely, absolutely. So I have some prejudices. This is what I want, what I think is true. What I think is true is that science needs desperately a better cultural narrative. Now, this may be different in different countries and cultures, but in the UK and the West, at least, science for most people is something they do not possess or have confidence over or appreciate or glean from. It's something that experts do in strange ways, in strange places. And I don't believe that's healthy. If you think about other expert activities that are deeply human, like music and sport and art, having a community of experts does not imply that they are not uniformly grasped confidently, and that's important, particularly in times of scientifically important policy like COVID. Second thing that I want to say, which is perhaps a little novel, is that science science has a long human history, or in fact, the activity we now call science, by other names perhaps, has had centuries or millennia of history of engaging with the material world around us, and that therefore, both historically as well as it were sociologically, it is important to regain, find new ways of gaining a public widespread grasp of this deeply cultural activity. Therefore, that this current perception that science is just part of our modern age is harmful in a number of ways. It actually impoverishes people's well-being, because there are ways in which a lay appreciation and delight in a scientifically informed, it can paralyze public debate. I need look no further than the vaccine issues, for example, in many countries, not so much India, I'm pleased to say, but that paralyzed debate around science and set free other narratives, conspiracy narratives. And one particular thing that this perception does distort, out of all recognition, the historical interesting relation of science and religion. So, well, press on. So, what's my manifesto? So this is the summary at the beginning of everything, so that you can see what I'm going to say, and then the rest is sort of detail. There's a narrative deficit. This information deficit that people have idea is the problem. When it comes to vaccine or conspiracy theories or anti-climate change, our reaction as scientists tends to be just to respond with more information, or more factual information, more evidence, and that doesn't seem to work. Why doesn't it seem to work? The reason it doesn't work is because these counter and anti-scientific moves are not informed by information, so information won't address them. They're informed by narratives. So we need a better story about science. That's my point. And this is exemplified by complex public impasses over the many years. Nanotechnology is one example. Genetically modified organisms is another. I'm going to report briefly on studies I've been involved with on those, and COVID. In terms of ancient resource, I'm going to draw your attention to a very ancient poem on natural wisdom that can actually be found in the Old Testament of the Bible. It's the book of Job, and Hebrew scholars reassure those of us who aren't Hebrew scholars that it contains the highest Hebrew poetry in all Hebrew literature. It also is an astonishing read for a scientist. One particular passage in it, which we'll come to, and I have strong evidence that this is the case, because on many occasions I've had opportunity to ask my scientific colleagues all over the world, by the way, have you ever come across this extraordinary nature poem, which is called The Lord's Answer, or God's Answer to Job? in the later chapters of the book of Job, it is a wonderful poem of nature, and they've often in the Bible. Why don't you just read it? It's just 2 pages and tell me what you think. And they've always come back astonished and impressed. So, and when it comes to science and religion, I think it's all about a little connecting word, a preposition. People talk about theology and science, or religion and science, and I think that's the wrong question. I think the right question, the right human question, the human narrative question, is to start asking what a theology of science might be. This could be public theology. It's not just for confessional believers in one faith or another, though I will be deriving some thoughts, some fuel for this fire from the Old Testament. And this all sounds very historical and abstract, but I think it actually allows us very practical wisdom to address some of the policy and public perception of science problems that I've identified. We can reappraise science culturally, anthropologically, and theologically. So that's where we're going to go this morning. If you don't like that, now's the good time to leave. But that's where we're going. And invite me back another day to talk about the molecular physics of silk, or whatever science I'm talking about. But this is what you want to know about today. 3 examples just to make my point that the public narrative of science at Durham University about 10 years ago, a bit longer than that, deepening ethical engagement of participating in nanotechnology. You remember nanotechnologies. When they first got going, there were all stories that these little nanobots that the scientists, technologists would create in their laboratories would run wild and create a grey goo that would consume us. I think Prince Charles said something like that once upon a time. So this project examined some of the oppositional, rather fearful narratives around science, and found that underneath all of the written blogs, conversations, vox pop, objections to this science were 5 underlying narratives, each one had one of 5 underlying stories which keep cropping up in the public perception of the dangers of science. And they run something like this. There's the be careful what you wish for narrative, the risk narrative. Once we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what we might unleash. These are dangerous people doing dangerous things. Second draws on Pandora's box. Pandora, due to daughter of Zeus, it was the origin myth in Greek mythology for evils and troubles. And Pandora was given that it's the Greek grip and this jar on how you create. Once you've invented an atomic weapon, you can't uninvent it. That's the idea. The third is a sort of sacred narrative about nature. We shouldn't mess with nature because nature is somehow godlike or reserved. As nature and human intervention, nature is just wrong. Those are 3 sort of ancient narratives. The 4th and 5th are more modern. They're the narrative being kept in the dark of exclusion, and the sort of more Marxist narrative of the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Now, these 5 narratives can be summarized even further. It was part of this interdisciplinary project, and said, yeah, actually, these occurred before. In this these narratives that you found underlying this science study crop up all through history. They are sort of narratives. They're the narrative of desire. Be careful what you wish for. The danger of desire. The narrative of evil, opening the box and letting the evil out. The narrative of the sacred. Don't mess with sacred nature. The narrative of alienation. You're being kept in the dark by the cognoscenti who know, or in the light, in the knowledge, and exploitation. So we'll be, and there's other literature on this. You might want to look at Blumenberg on metaphor. Now, here's another project, again, a very interdisciplinary project funded by the Templeton Foundation, again at Durham University, which I was involved in directly. This was like all the projects I'll mention here. We're stretching our interdisciplinary minds here from the social sciences to the sciences and the humanities as well. GM Futuros, it involved plant scientists, biologists, agriculturalists, philosophers, social scientists, geographers, and a theologian. Oh, India as well as Mexico is with different cultures, to explore it is in those countries around genetically modified agriculture. There's a book there which came out of the project called Governing Agricultural Sustainability, and a policy brief to the UK government as well, which we sent internationally. Now, I'm well aware that one of those countries is the one into which I'm speaking to this august audience. So it is with quite a little trepidation that I talk further. Now, I notice that Dr. Vida has had a problem with an echo. That might be that someone else isn't muted. Is there a problem, general problem with the words? I could just try turning my video off and see if that improves bandwidth. Shall I do that? I'm going to try turning my video off for a while, and please could manager or someone put in the chat, tell me if that helps. And please could manager or someone put in the chat. We're going to look at some innovations in the intellectual side, the methodological side, and policy. So across 3 countries, levels of communities. We looked at farmers, we explored households buying products, the scientists involved in the GM products, and the regulators themselves, to see whether we could make an improvement. It's okay, good. Well, I think I'll keep my video off because that seems to have helped. Oh, you want me to connect it again? Well, I'll try again then. But if the video makes the sound worse, then
yeah, I think maybe if
then we'll go back to turning it off.
So to be off for a while, and at the end, if you can switch it on.
Off for a while, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll keep it on for a while. Yeah, your voice is breaking up too, so do message me with instructions. So I think that's the best thing to do. The point about this slide is you can see that the narratives change enormously. Let's take Brazil, for example. The farmers laid a lot of blame at the level of the scientists, and yet seem to have faith in science. Mexico had a huge problem with one particular crop. In other words, that the science of genetically modified organisms was perfectly acceptable. You might know maize to the Mexicans is a God-given crop. Of particular interest is the contrast between the view from regulators in India that we found when we did this work in 2014-13, and in Brazil and Mexico with regard to the post-colonial narrative, that in some countries like Brazil, GM was seen as neo-colonialism, whereas in India we found, but you can correct me because you know better than I do, that GM technologies was part of an essential post-colonial technological independence. So I could spend a whole evening talking about this, but I'd better not. But just to say that the narrative richness was huge, and that the missing part that everyone wanted more was more consultation, but to belong to the conversation more. So there were some aspects of this that science, because science is edgy it's right at the envelope of what we can do, suffers all the time. If we overpromise, original technical promises were not delivered. There was very little engagement of stakeholders in the conversations they so longed for in regulation or cultural considerations. And there's a huge, massive disagreement on what regulatory structures should be. Again, coming out of this, can you hear the big complaint is that a broader community, apart from scientists and regulators, were not involved in the deep discussions around the science and wanted to be. Now, these narratives of despair that I mentioned from Dupuy, these 5 ancient grim narratives cropped up in this debate. Again, we consider our own seeds as sacred, says the Mexicans. They're an object of one Indian narrative was a narrative of evil, that anything can, any horrible things can be unleashed by this. The sacred nature enshrines barriers to trans genes was another Mexican narrative. Alienation, no one consults us, said the Brazilian farmers. And exploitation, we're being exploited, it'll cause harm and problems, said the Mexican farmers. So those 5 dark and dismal narratives that often swirl around scientific topics came up in this project as well. And just as a third example, in case you still don't believe me, this is an example researched by my postdoctoral colleague Francisca Colt. It's part of a project that Manoj was kind enough to mention at the beginning. Francisca has been researching narratives around public discussion of the virus and vaccines. When will we have a vaccine? The Archbishop of Canterbury called it an unmitigated evil, the virus, that is. We brought this pandemic on ourselves, said Jane Goodall, zoologist and naturalist. General practitioner doctors in the UK were complaining about the lack of information. They were being kept in the dark and massive disparities in risk from background. And these are, of course, yet again, the same old narratives of desire, evil, sacred, alienation, exploitation. And note something about those narratives. They're all negative. It's not a positive narrative around science. Actually, they're all very godless and secular too. So there's actually been an interesting suggestion to mine theological sociologists who, in looking at the failures of over-promising and under-delivery of science, continues to urge the mining of theological resources for this. That's first quote is about the problem. Everything gets, well, more and more technologies are required to answer problems caused by technology. The real question, he says, is to have the same type of patience and energy as God, the Creator himself. And those resources look promising. So another clue as to where we might go and what this human condition is, I picked up from an extraordinary commentator. This is the literary scholar, George Steiner, post-Holocaust European American Jew, held chairs in 5 great universities at once, I think, wrote an extraordinary book called Real Presences. And it talks to us. I felt, us reading this as a scientist, I was very touched because he contrasts the humanities and scientists in a way that I think puts science in rather a rosy light. But at one point, he's talking about art in this book and says this. He says, only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability, the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. He writes a very rich English, doesn't he? You have to read every sentence he writes a couple of times. But what he's commenting on here is the gap that the human condition involves, being fish out of water, somehow. We are uncomfortable in time, we're uncomfortable in our environment, we're frightened by the forces nature can unleash, and we're frightened now by what we can do to the material world. There is an incommensurality which requires the re-establishment of communication to the sheer inhuman others of matter. And Steiner is arguing that this is what art does. But when I read this as a scientist, I remember thinking, yes, Mr. Steiner, but surely this is what scientists do as well. An absolutely lovely question from, that's one of the five dismal narratives. We're being kept in the dark by the scientists. That could change the shape, indeed, and that leads to fear. So, well, I think it's partly true. We're not deliberately hiding anything, except those of us in commercial companies who have to hide some things for commercial profit, and those involved not trying to, but by default we do, because we don't make those extra efforts to engage a common contemplation of science. This is where I'm going, in the way that perhaps expert musicians do. You see, I mean, I can't pick up a violin and play a violin. It's a mystery to me how those notes are made. My children do, but I enjoy listening to them, and I can even appreciate it critically. You see, without having to do it myself. That's the sort of scientific engagement, critical engagement that I'm after. So let me plunge us straight. We need some resources here. Let me plunge us straight into this wonderful ancient poem, Wisdom in Reconciling the Ancient World. Here's William Blake's, one of William Blake's. You may have seen other ones along the way. You will see more finally in terms of charity and generosity, but he is the chaotic side of the world, the storms and illnesses, with a God who seems out of control with his universe morally and physically, and demands to be heard. And for 37 chapters, God is silent, but in the 38th, God speaks. It's called the Lord's Answer, but it's a strange answer because, beautiful poem though it is, the answer is in the form of questions. Questions, questions, questions. And they're beautiful questions. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? Where is the way to the abode of light? From whose womb comes the ice? Do you know the laws of the heavens? And can you apply them to the earth? Now, these are poetic, of course, questions, but they're nonetheless questions about the natural world, about salt and fresh water, about the origin of light, about how liquid is transformed to solid ice. At one point, there's a question about how the Pleiades cluster together while stars of Orion are separate. And they're extraordinary questions, and they're invitational questions to engage with the way that the universe is. Of course, they're not spoken with any anticipation of modern science whatsoever, but they are spoken with a questioning interest. By the way, this is what set me off writing this book, Faith and Wisdom in Science, because I reckoned that what I'd done here is to find a tributary of that urge that drives humans to do science. At the same time, a colleague of mine, Paul Phillips at the University of Oxford, was writing a book from the point of view of a humanities scholar, also with Oxford University Press, published in the same year as the science book from the scientist myself. It's called Seeing the World and Knowing God. And from his fragmented, he sees the humanities as being detached from ordinary people in unhealthy ways. I saw the sciences, and he too pointed to resources in the Old Testament wisdom tradition and the participative seeing and practice in the world. So I thought that was fascinating, and I've had a number of conversations with him. That's just beside the by. So let's just see a little bit more where this text comes from. Here's a sort of structure map of the book of Job, which theologian, Old Testament specialist David Kleins, who I met and talked with about the book, calls the most intense book theologically and intellectually of the Old Testament. What happens is you have an introduction in which Job begins to suffer, and then three friends, later joined by a fourth, but three friends come and surround him and start arguing with him. And there's a cycle of speeches where Job speaks, then one friend, then Job comes again, and Bildad, the second friend, and then Job, and that happens twice. And their worldview is that nature effectively repays you for your moral actions. It's a very naive, very childlike, childish view of nature. It doesn't really get anywhere. But these cycles spiral around in greater and greater argument until they really break down. There's an extraordinary first hymn called the Hymn to Wisdom at the end of the third cycle, which is only a partial cycle, and fourth character shows up before the Lord's answer and the closing narrative in which Job is healed. But one thing I noticed, and the reason I wanted to write about this book, is that I didn't think that the humanities scholars, sounds like a bit of scientific bravura, but I didn't think I thought that a view from a scientist on this book was missing. And the reason is that this answer by God to Job's predicament, being hurt by nature, was inadequate. So one of the arguments that the scholars have is that this argument doesn't address Job's complaints at all, because Job's complaints are moral ones, that he is immorally suffering undeservedly. But the Lord's answer points him and our readers to natural phenomena, particularly chaotic ones. And yet, one thing I'd noticed, maybe because scientists are aware of any text, particularly sensitive to texts about nature, that contemplation of natural structures is there throughout the book. Each speech cycle has a background of the material world. What is more is that those speech cycles change their form. So inanimate nature of earth, stone, sea, winds is the first background to the first cycle. Animate nature of plants and animals and their products are the background to the second. And when the arguments become personal and vicious, the whole Hebrew cosmology unfolds in heavens, moon, and stars in the third narrative. So there is a point here. In fact, as I point out, we can take a whole nature or a nature science trail through the entire book. It starts with the force of wind and storm. It continues with medical, rather revolting aspects of Job's illness described in detail. He's afflicted by nature, you see, from without and within. He responds with his own creation narrative. Actually, it's more like an ancient, an anti-narrative. He wants the stars of the dawn of the first day of his life to be darkened and therefore essentially uncreated. And then the nature for Job becomes a whole metaphor for the unwise, foolish advice of his friends. They're treacherous. As the waddies, they were his friends, but now they're accusing him unjustly. They are therefore like the seasonal streams that dry up in the heat and swell with the thawing snow. You can't grow anything. You're either dried up or you flood. You can't grow crops here. His own body is becoming chaotic and rotten. And so his complaint is not so much a moral one just circling around his own story. Job's complaint is that the creator of the world is out of control of his creation, that the physical world is chaotic and random and aleatoric. Look, he holds back the waters, there's drought, he lets them loose, they overwhelm the earth. Throughout the book, there is this extraordinary clash, however, of the hopelessness that I've just described and elements of hope, and even in the words of Job's accusers. So here's Eliphaz early in the book saying something remarkable about the future hope for Job. Ruin and blight you'll mock at this future stage, he will say. And read this, for you will be in covenant with the stones of the field. Now, that word covenant is an extraordinary one. The Hebrew is berit, and it really does refer to the highest possible form of relationship. Kings make covenants. And in the biblical story, God makes a covenant with Abraham and Moses and so forth. And some commentators have therefore refused to translate it as covenant here because it seems ridiculous that one could have a covenant with a stone. But this made me think of George Steiner's wisdom many centuries later, that the role of art, and I think science too, I hope you agree with me, is to awaken into communicability the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. It's to establish a relationship with the unhuman, unfamiliar world around us. That, but hope slips away. I said it's a clash of hope. It's a swinging. It's the text swings from hope to hopelessness. Here's an extraordinary ancient world narrative illustration of the geological erosion as an erosion of hope. And then at this point, when all the arguments in the book become irreconcilable, a new voice speaks with what is called the Hymn to Wisdom. Now, this is a poem prior to the Lord's Answer that I referred to a little while ago. I can't answer that last question, I'm afraid. Bear with me. Which is a hymn to wisdom. It starts with a poem about the miner and mining technology, which is a rather extraordinary and striking analogy, it turns out. Note what's going on here. There's a discussion of the structure, the geological structure of the world beneath the surface. Earth from which food comes forth at the end is underneath changed as if by fire. Its rocks a source of lapis with its flecks of gold. So you have the jewels and the metal ores and the raw noble metals there underneath the earth. The point here, what's being done in this text is that it's contrasting the human ability by our art to divine the beneath the surface, literally in the case of mining, from animals which only perceive the surface of the earth. It later says the hawk with her sharp eyes or the lion only sees the surface of the earth. And that ability to see into nature is by the end of this poem ascribed to nature's creator himself. God looks to the ends of the earth and beheld everything under heaven, so as to assign a weight to the wind and the waters by measure. I was delighted, you may know that I worked at the University of Durham for a while, and Durham is England's northeast's centre for mining technology. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher closed the mines a generation or so ago, as some of you will know. Very, very sadly for the communities there. But in the parish church of Easington Colliery, here, this is a window, a stained glass window in the parish church, and you'll see that hymn to wisdom about the miner. And every boy and girl in infant school in that colliery town knows this passage from the book of Job because it's called the miner's prayer. It's the prayer in the Bible where miners are mentioned. So then comes the Lord's answer that I've mentioned before, which is extraordinary because it's a poem of 168, I think, questions, real questions about those areas of science we now would call astronomy, meteorology, geology, zoology. And it picks up on this hymn to wisdom. Have you journeyed to the deepest parts, to the underlying structure of the world? And continues to ask questions about the unknown parts of nature. Now, there's another problem with the interpretation of this text, which is that many commentators have seen it as a sort of put down. Job, do you know where ice comes from? You don't. Well, you don't know much, do you? Then stop questioning me. But this isn't what questions do in a Hebrew melia, and isn't what we do when we're teaching science. We use questions all the time. People have always used questions as challenges this simple view that nature encodes morality and asks us and Job to think about the way that chaos opens up possibilities for the world that a completely ordered structure doesn't. If you like, let's go to the three-body gravitational problem. The two-body gravitational problem is not sufficiently interesting, and it's a very subtle text that takes, for example, lightning and says, yes, lightning is chaotic, but it is guided in particular paths nonetheless. So this extraordinary poem tackles this accusation that nature is out of control and suggests that what looks like being out of control or chaotic is necessary for a fruitful life-supporting nature. It actually releases Job and does what George Steiner, in different words, suggests in the modern world, and what science might provide for people more generally, which is to help them, individual and corporate need, to become reconciled to this strange world. It's invitational, it's participative. It affirms that physical nature and our understanding of it is of fundamental human significance. It points towards eschatological posh word, but it points to a time when we will understand the world better. Science becomes a sort of holy task here. I won't defend that in detail, but I'll just point out that you remember our leitmotif, these five dismal narratives around science that we wanted to replace with a better one. Those five that Jean Pierre Dupuy pointed out are there in the different voices of the book of Job. Exploitation, nature enshrines moral law. Or Elihu says it's eternal mystery. Zophar says you should read nature like a book. It's a sacred book. Job thinks it's uncontrolled chaos. And at one point he's accused by God of making an object of worship. But in the book of Job, the narratives don't stop there with those five. They provide a sixth, which we've just been considering, which is that our engagement with nature is the way of wisdom. Now, how could we actually use this, and how's it been used in history? Turns out that the book of Job has been very significant in the history of science. This is not taught in high school anymore. Both in the early modern period, which we haven't got time to discuss now, it was extremely important in the 17th century. But much earlier than that, it was, for example, the motivation for the first proper geometric optics theory of the rainbow. Here it is. It was one of my favorite examples of double discovery. Kamal al-Din in Baghdad, great Islamic scientist, and a Western scientist, a Benedictine, Theodoric of Freiburg, both in 1308-9, wrote texts where they used experiments with camera obscuras to spot that raindrops refract and reflect light, refract it twice, reflect it once, and that forms the rainbow. And Theodoric quotes the book of Job and the question of God's question about the light scattering in the skies as his motivation for exploring the physics, optical physics of the rainbow. It wasn't Newton who helped us understand the rainbow. It was these guys 350 years sooner. There's the view out of the Royal Society in London towards the British Academy and the beautiful rainbow just the other day. Hope you enjoy that. So let's try and come to an end, and then we can have a bit of discussion. I want to summarize what I want to draw from this attempt to mine ancient literature for a public theology of science, a new narrative of science, something that's participative, relational. We create this together. It's somehow healing a broken relationship of humans with nature. We know how broken that is now. It celebrates this long history of relationship that we have with nature, a high view of a human aptitude. And maybe it does something very important. It adds to this idea that science is just knowledge, the essential aspect of wisdom. It helps people understand that it's ambiguous and painful. We think the vaccines will work. We're not sure, but we're doing our best. There's a balance of order and chaos that everyone needs to understand. And for our schools and universities, it helps us to become teachers who celebrate questions, not answers. Why is it that I have to explain to my new PhD students coming to do theoretical physics with me or biophysics that after 15 years of rewarding them for getting the right answer, all that skill will be useless to them now. And what they now have to do is to come up with creative questions. And this is somehow of our role and work of love together. So consequences. Science isn't just about our flourishing, but there aren't any predetermined boundaries. There is nothing sacred about nature other than our building a flourishing relationship to it. And not just for scientists, but that others, I can't help draw the conclusion that this thought relationship with nature is therapeutic, and making science an expert activity only is harming people, or rather restricting a sort of possible therapy from them. That we can inform practically policy narratives in public debate with this underlying positive narrative about science. And this can work through the media as well. We can help our media be more engaged and thoughtful, not so instrumentalist. A consequence is that actually, by the way, rather than seeing science as a sort of threat, churches and other religious organizations and community need to see science as part of a holy gift to them, to us, and we need to drop this conflictual stance of science and religion. I can show you it works. We've been working this project with David Wilkinson at Durham with the bishops of the Church of England on getting their minds around science. And this has been, in one particular case, enormously helpful. This is a policy debate that happened in the House of Lords on fracking. And we were able to inform some of the best advice on the public political debate on fracking came through the Anglican Church, through work we've done introducing scientists in that area. So there's a little example. Another example was during the pandemic, fear of vaccines or vaccine reticence has been combated most effectively and often by local churches. So just to conclude, and then we can have further discussion. Submerged narratives, these dismal, dark, suspicious narratives around science, need equally buried, healthy, bright narratives to address them, not just data. And these narrative networks are complex. They aren't necessarily consistent, but we need to be consistent in ours. I'm suggesting that among many ancient sources, the Old Testament wisdom collection, and particularly the Book of Job, is actually contains a sort of treasure of resources to mine for new, fresh narratives. And removing this opposition of science and faith is one of the things we need to do to be promising and practical in our theologies and our politics around our science. What I wish to say, so I'm going to stop showing my screen now. I'll attempt to turn the video on and see if that works. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Tom, for enlightening all of us about this particular topic. Yeah. So there are a few questions which are there in the chat section. Would you like to take up those.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I addressed a couple as we went along, as you might have noticed. I think I've done this perception one. The state of energy. Now, I'm a little puzzled by that from Gang of Verma. Well, there's questions, a complex question about energy and levels of maturity in science and technology. And again, energy. I'm not sure I can say much about energy because, of course, that's a term that across the different cultural spans I've been referring to means very different things at different times. I think perhaps rather than energy, which is rather raw, maybe a more helpful term is order, or perhaps therefore entropy, if you want to be, or negative entropy, if you want to be abstract terms. I think I've always thought that what is much its content of energy, but its content of order, and that it seems to be rational, and that our rational minds somehow reflect the rationality or order of the world. I think that's something, a contemplative mystery. I think it's wonderful, and I think that that's what broader public can enjoy thinking about. A wonderful author, a lady called Andrea Wolfe, who wrote a biography of Humboldt. And it turned out she was told when she was at school by her chemistry teacher that she was stupid and would never understand science and all this stuff. But she wrote this wonderful book about Humboldt and his science. And she said to me on conversation, I was congratulating her on a Royal Society prize. She said, science is, I wish I said that, but anyway, she said this: science is like a beautiful palace with many doors, But at school, she said, they only show us one door, which is, our exams in physics and chemistry and biology. And she said, we can't all go through that door. But I went through the door of writing biography of a great scientist into that, and that's opened up science for me. And I thought this was a very powerful thing. So whether energy or order or poetry or beauty, I think there are many doors into understanding nature. And I think when we're working with different people from different backgrounds, we need to do some extra work of exploring, opening different doors, which are equally good as an entry point into the wonderful richness we enjoy called science, which we want to be sharing better with other people. Perhaps that addresses Yash Thaker's point about eliminating the perceptions of science. I think a way is to find ways into science that draws on the history of it that we've often forgotten. For example, as another example, other than the historical ones, with stories of people, needless to say, this is all very gendered, and there are female voices in the history of science that ought to be given a much more central stage place. There are diverse global voices on science. White, Western, old male has, as usual, in many things, here I am in that category, but we have far too large a piece of the public perception pie of science. Why don't people talk about Emmy Noether as much as they do about Albert Einstein in terms of 20th century physics? They should do. She was just as influential, every bit as important. Look her up. Well, all of you know about Noether. Noether's theorem, fabulous symmetry. Anyone can understand Noether's theorem. It's the most profound thing ever discovered in the 20th century, and the men of Princeton sat on her in the most appalling way. There we go. Poetry. Did you know that much of the early prehistory of the Royal Society, the 17th century story of science was science writing in poems. Why? There weren't any scientific journals. Here's the thing. It wasn't clear in this great burst of experimental method in the 1600s what the new literary form for science would be. It turned out to be, because of the plague and historical contingencies, to be the letter. And the letters are collected into the journal, the Proceedings of the Royal Society, right? Now we have Phys Rev letters. My lovely postdoc, Charlie Schaefer, got one last year. We love writing these letters. But if history had been different, it would have been the Physical Review poems, PRP, not PRL, because poetry was a very strong candidate as the correct literary form for science. Why? Well, because it's so ordered and structured. It makes you think. It makes you put things into relation. It can do things that prose can't do. Poetry can make us think about transcendent worlds far better than prose can because of the way it propels metaphor with form. Well, you know all this. So, for some people, poetry will be a way into science when, school exams in physics. Oh, definitely not. There's a brand new journal called Consilience. I could put that in the chat if you like. For those of you who want to follow that up a bit. I'll grab it's free to air, and there we go, Consilience Journal. Just started a couple of years ago, and it's a journal of science poetry. It's very good. I think that probably takes us to the end of the questions in the chat. Oh, one new brand, one from PR Vida.
Yeah, there is one last question. Yes.
Yes. People do not understand much of what he says, but still love him. Is not this a different angle to the politics view of science? It has always old matter and new generation not been anywhere. What a great question. I'm not sure that the cult of the individual is very helpful in the sort of understanding of science that I'm pushing here. And Einstein, I'm sure he helped with his lovely examples of his dreams, his Gedanken experiments and all this. And by the way, I mean, a school friend of mine, when I was at school, has a mother who grew up in Princeton. And when she was a little girl, she would take her maths homework with her best friend to a park in Princeton, sit down on a bench and try to work out her maths homework. And every day, an old man with white fuzzy hair would sit down next to them and ask if he could help them with their maths homework. So that turned out to be Einstein. So he's a wonderful man, obviously, and I find that through my school friend, his mother, that's the closest link I have with Albert Einstein. You couldn't have a better one, though, could you? So I'm not sure but however, what I want to mention, because the point is that science doesn't just have to be vicarious any more than Brahms's violin concerto can be vicarious with it critically and enjoy it. I think we need to find ways in which the science itself, for a new generation, becomes confident with and has the confidence to ask questions about it and its deployment. This is the point at which I think we'll get a healthy discussion of GM foods. The next one coming around the corner is human genome editing, and we just had a big workshop on that at the Crick Institute. In terms of ethics, that's going to be global. It's going to be vital to hear everyone's voices around what we do with this massive responsibility. We are now able to edit our own genomes. We could, in principle, eliminate inherited genetic diseases. What a wonderful gift. But that same gift brings with it huge opportunities for damage and harm. Super races, superhumans, and so on. Now, there's no easy answer to this. Shutting the door won't work. Opening the door to all comers won't work either. We have to, and this is a whole public that needs to appreciate how science works, what these decisions are, and how we bring all our traditions of the best of humanity to bear on it. Yeah, well, thank you. That's a super question. Maj, I don't know if we have time for any more, whether we're nearing.
I think, sir, we have exhausted all possible questions in that case, yes. So thank you very much, Professor Tom, for sparing your valuable time and enlightening all the students, faculty members, and the fellows of the Science Academy. And any last words of wisdom or concluding remarks from your side, then I seek your permission to close the session for today. Yeah.
No, just to thank you. I mean, I've said all I could possibly say to this august assembly. Very, very grateful indeed. To wish you very well in your own science, in your own science studies. But to wish you perhaps, maybe if I could wish for anything after today, just to first of all, to understand what a wonderful gift science is and how deeply human it is. It's not deeply human. And to find ways, maybe that analogy of the palace, find way. And if you find one of those doors, because they're covered over with people appreciate science that they didn't before, please tell me about it. Please tell me. I'm trying to look for these doors like Cinderella's palace, but I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, sir. And on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences India Delhi chapter and the host institution, the Upadhyaya College, I would like to thank you once again and all the attendees who have been there with us for all throughout these last 60 minutes. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.